When most people think of the Roman Empire, names like Caesar, Pompey, Augustus, and Nero often come to mind. Famous generals and infamous emperors. During the period we often call the Dark Ages, many people assume the story of Rome finally went cold, as barbarian hordes ravaged the continent, plunging Europe into chaos and despair. But what if I told you that not only did the empire continue to survive, but that thanks to a brilliant yet little-known general, it was almost restored to its full prior extent, as he waged a relentless war to reclaim Rome's former glory. General Belisarius is considered by many to be among the finest military commanders who ever lived, and yet few people today have ever heard of him. From the deserts of Persia to Africa, the Mediterranean, and the whole of Italy, he liberated the eternal city of Rome from the barbarians, not once, but twice, and in almost all his battles was heavily outnumbered, winning through deception, maneuver, and sheer audacity. If you're just a little bit curious about this little-known but brilliant commander, then join us as we dive into the life and times of Belisarius, the last of the great Roman generals. Our story begins in 476 AD, with the collapse of the western half of the Roman Empire. A generation earlier, Attila the Hun had ravaged both the east and the west, his plundering hordes penetrating to the very walls of Byzantine Constantinople, to modern Orleans in Gaul, and on to the Italian peninsula, only sparing the city of Rome itself because a local famine left his army without supplies and at risk of serious disease. His unchecked marauding throughout the Roman heartland showed just how vulnerable the empire really was, largely due to internal disunity and upheaval. Ambitious generals, hungry for power, had always been a political reality in ancient Rome, with one usurper being replaced by another, as rival legions and Senate factions promoted their own candidates for the top job. Complicating this volatile political climate were the growing demands of the foederati, client barbarian tribes, who in return for military support received economic subsidies, food, and protection by Rome. But by the 5th century, tax revenue throughout the empire was under serious threat, and many of these foreign client states, coming under increasing pressure by nomadic invaders from the east, lobbied the Senate to allow them to settle permanently within the borders of the empire for security. Now, Attila the Hun was just the last in a long line of barbarian invaders of Italy. In 410, Alaric had sacked the Eternal City with his Visigoth army. The Visigoths then moved on westwards to greener pastures, eventually settling in southern Gaul and Spain, while the Vandals, having already crossed the Straits of Gibraltar into North Africa, conquered a large part of the Maghreb in what is today Tunisia and Algeria, even sacking Carthage in 439 AD. And from there, emerging as a significant maritime power, occupying most of the Mediterranean islands and engaging in widespread piracy against its neighbours. In the north, however, with Attila the Hun's most recent penetration, Rome's remaining barbarian allies, nervous, hungry, and desperate, decided to take matters into their own hands. So it was that Odoacer, a leader within the multi-ethnic Hun, Gothic and Germanic borderlands north of the Alps, mustered his own army of tribal allies and crossed into northern Italy, where, observing the shambolic state of Rome's defences, he decided to stage a coup, proclaiming himself Rex, or King of Italia. Heading straight for the capital at Ravenna, in 476 he deposed the child emperor Romulus Augustus, a puppet of state oligarchs who had already installed and dethroned 8 other emperors in the previous 20 years. But Odoacer was not about to let these fat cat politicians dictate his future, so he personally sent the imperial regalia to Zeno, the Eastern Roman emperor over in Constantinople, hoping to gain his blessing, which he indeed received, being appointed dux, or Duke of Italy. This legitimized his rule, albeit subordinate to the Eastern emperor, and to most historians this event marks the end of the Western Roman Empire as a continuous independent state. By all accounts, Odoacer was a fair and competent ruler, not only consolidating Rome's domestic borders, but also restructuring and improving its stagnating economy. Surprisingly, he succeeded largely because of the grudging support of the Roman Senate, whose institutions and privileges he was careful to preserve. His tolerance of existing religious and cultural practices and overall generosity also helped to prevent rebellions by the indigenous Italians. Odoacer became so popular that the emperor over in Constantinople eventually began to view him as a possible secession threat. So Zeno did what any paranoid megalomaniac does. He bribed a volatile and untrustworthy neighbouring power to invade and topple him. With the dissolution of the Huns in 454, following soon after Attila's death in Copulatio with his new German bride, his numerous subject tribes throughout Eastern Europe began to assert their own independence. One of these groups were the Ostrogoths, or the Eastern Goths, who had for some time been wrangling with Emperor Zeno over possession of the Balkans, but who he now invited to invade the western provinces, overthrow Odoacer, and take the whole lot for himself, with Zeno's full blessing. Greek politics at its finest. Anyway, the Ostrogoths, led by their legendary king Theodoric the Great, now marched through Illyricum, over the Julian Alps, and descended into northern Italy, winning a number of strategic battles and forcing Odoacer to withdraw to his capital, Ravenna, where he was promptly put under siege. Eventually, the two brokered a deal to split Italy between them, but when the besieged king was invited to a banquet to celebrate the armistice, Theodoric, having just delivered an affectionate toast, promptly leaped onto his guest and strangled him with his bare hands. So began the reign of the Ostrogoths over all of Italy. Like Odoacer before him, Theodoric was careful to preserve the existing political power structure, and in so doing, quickly won the support of the Senate, especially when it became clear to them that he was acting as viceroy to the Eastern Emperor. But all of these consecutive tribes of invading Goths, despite their promotion of cultural tolerance, maintained full control over military appointments, and generally segregated themselves away from their Latin subjects, in privileged communities governed by their own tribal customs. So this might be a good time for a short rabbit hole. Like the Foederati before them, the Goths were Arian Christians, part of a heretical movement which rejected the traditional notion of the Trinity, considering Jesus to be a secondary creation of God. Arianism, named after a 3rd century clergyman from Alexandria, held that the son is distinct from the father and therefore subordinate to him. Several bishops in the eastern part of the empire maintained this doctrine, and it was Arian missionaries such as Ulfilas or Wulfila who spread the belief north of the Black Sea and into Eastern Europe during their conversion of many of the pagan tribes there. By 325, the controversy had become significant enough that the Emperor Constantine called an assembly of bishops, which we know as the First Council of Nicaea, largely to debate this very issue, ultimately condemning the Arian doctrine and formulating the original Nicene Creed, which asserted that Christ is consubstantial and co-eternal with the Father. Dissenting bishops were either persecuted or, how shall we say, rehabilitated to the prevailing doctrine. The same treatment was meted out to the many other unorthodox and heretical sects prevalent at the time, such as Nestorianism and Monophysitism. Given that the barbarians of the north were outside the reach of Constantine's long arm of the law, the Arian model of Christology persisted and eventually became entrenched there. The Visigoths maintained their Arianism throughout their sojourn in Spain, right up until the late 6th century, while the Vandals had even taken it to North Africa, where, unlike their other Goth cousins, they went hardline, establishing Arianism as the official state religion, and in turn persecuting the local Roman Catholics. Theodoric, like his predecessor, was politically savvy and knew full well that the emperor over in Constantinople, or its other name, Byzantium, was just as inclined to have him dethroned as his predecessor. So he moved quickly to cement alliances with surrounding kingdoms, while nominally pledging his allegiance to the eastern, or I should say, sole remaining Roman emperor. His daughters were wedded to the Visigothic and Burgundian kings. His sister was married off to the Vandal king down in Africa, while he himself married the sister of the Frankish king Clovis I. But the Franks and Burgundians were staunch Catholics, such that, despite his new family connections, Theodoric occasionally found himself at war with them, particularly when the emperor, as predicted, eventually turned on him as well. As the years went by, agitation by the Greeks slowly made the Senate, anti-Arian clergy, and local population increasingly hostile to his rule. His patchwork of alliances likewise became ever more fragile. When he died in 526, the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy quickly began to unravel, as his daughter, Amalasuintha, acting as regent to her son, the 10-year-old crown prince Athalaric, struggled to keep the kingdom from falling apart. Being herself partly of Frankish and therefore Catholic descent, she lobbied the emperor for support and tried to have her son raised as a Roman rather than a Goth. While this placated the emperor, the move only served to further alienate her own Goth elites, who began openly agitating against her and the young crown prince. Now, while all this skullduggery was going on in Italy, over in Constantinople, the new Roman emperor was busy securing his own grip on power. Justin I, an illiterate Illyro-Thracian peasant, as a young man had risen rapidly through the ranks of the army, all the way to the rank of general, and in classic Roman political manoeuvring, even secured his own election, with the backing of the imperial guard, as emperor in 518. In time-honoured Roman fashion, he moved swiftly to solidify his position, assassinating rival claimants and buying the support of senators. Emperor Justin reaffirmed Byzantine support for Amalasuentha's Italian regency, and even moved to heal the rift between the Latin and Byzantine churches that had been festering for some time. So, with his ascension to the throne, the on-again, off-again love affair between the Greeks and Latins was, for the time being, hunky-dory. The only real threat to Eastern Roman power for the time being were its age-old rivals, the Persians, who were inheritors of the much older Parthian Empire. The Persians would come to be known as the Sassanid Empire, and they emerged to become a major regional player. The borderlands between these two great empires, stretching from the Caucasus south into modern Syria, had recently been the subject of raids and counter-raids in the vicinity of Armenia. But the Persian ruling dynasty was itself vulnerable to the treachery of its own numerous subject tribes and neighbours, so they generally lacked the wherewithal to launch a major offensive against Roman holdings. The eastern rump of the Roman Empire, on the other hand, lacked their own sufficient response to the Persian army's legendary heavy cavalry and mounted archers. So a long-standing peace treaty was eventually signed, with the Romans agreeing to pay subsidies to ensure stability in the region. The arrangement generally worked well. It was far cheaper to finance the Persians than it was to fight them, though on a number of occasions they would invade anyway, and lay siege to frontier cities to encourage the Romans to increase their tribute, because of inflation. Anyway, on one such occasion, in 506, being fed up with Persian extortion, Emperor Anastasius erected a fortress right on the border, at Dara, to act as a forward operations base and deterrent to further raids. This move was taken by the Persians as a provocation, and by Justin's time, negotiations and tribute had completely collapsed. The final pretext for outright war was the defection of several Christian territories in the Persian-controlled Caucasus over to the Romans, following pressure on them to convert to Zoroastrianism, the state religion of the Sassanid Empire at the time. The emperor scrambled to assemble an army to repel them. Now, if you recall, despite his meteoric rise to the throne, Emperor Justin was largely illiterate. His great talent, though, was surrounding himself with excellent advisers. One such was his nephew, Flavius Petrus Sabatius, whom he formally adopted and invested with the name Justinianus, or Justinian. In his later years, the emperor had come to rely so heavily on Justinian that many viewed him to be the real power behind the throne. An example was his lobbying to repeal legislation that forbade the nobility from marrying the lower classes. This was solely to enable Justinian to marry his new sweetheart, a notorious, how shall we say this, adult entertainer by the name of Theodora. She was a no-nonsense street hustler who made Minnie the Moocher look like Mother Teresa, and we'll have more to say about her later. But for now, the aging emperor, seeing storm clouds on the horizon, made the newlywed Justinian an army general, and even his co-emperor, entrusting him with the defence of the eastern provinces. So it was that, by 524, several skirmishes had broken out from the desert borderlands in Upper Mesopotamia all the way to the Roman colonies in modern Yemen. By 525, the Christian populations of the Persian Caucasus were in full rebellion, and the Persians moved quickly to quash the revolt. Justin finally acted and sent an expeditionary force into Persian-held Armenia, capturing several cities and plundering them for booty and captives. At the head of the campaign was Justinian and his two generals, Citas, the emperor's own brother-in-law, and Belisarius, a young and hitherto unknown commander who we only know as being the head of Justinian's personal bodyguard. Accounts tell us that Belisarius was born around the year 500 in the fortified Thracian town of Germania, today situated near the Bulgarian town of Sapareva Banja. He was likely of Thracian or Slavic descent, his name having roots in the Slavic words for white prince. Though no records exist, his family may have been connected to Justin's, which may account for his preferment. Having passed through the Imperial Cadet College as an engineer, he experienced a rapid rise through the ranks of the military. By 526, he was the head of young co-emperor Justinian's personal bodyguard, with full command of a force of his own heavy armoured cataphract cavalry that would become known as the Bucellarii. Their successful recent expedition into Armenia prompted a repeat later in the year, but by now the Persians had mopped up all resistance in their rebelling territories and had shored up their defences such that Citas and Belisarius were checked and forced to retire back across the border. By August, Emperor Justin had died, and Justinian ascended the throne as Justinian I. He moved immediately to reorganize the entire army, recruiting a new cadre of young officers and redefining provincial governorships to better facilitate coordination and defense. Now, the army of the 6th century Roman Empire was no longer the juggernaut of massed heavy infantry legions that is such a familiar mainstay of Hollywood depictions of Roman armies. Its numerous defeats at the hands of Goths, Huns, and Persians, with their mounted archers and heavy cataphract units, forced a complete rethink and evolution of army organisation. By Belisarius's time, though the number of legions had actually increased, their strength had been reduced from 5,000 to 1,000 men apiece, with a corresponding increase in the number of cavalry and auxiliary missile units, making the entire army more balanced and, more importantly, more mobile. Significantly, the Romans also adopted many of the weapons and armour of their adversaries. The famous Roman spear, the pilum, fell out of favour both with and against cavalry units. Adoption of longer spears in formations reminiscent of Alexander the Great's phalanxes provided much better defence against the waves of Persian heavy cavalry, while adopting the asymmetrical compound bow of the Huns, along with training by numerous mercenary Hunnic cavalry divisions, now afforded the army with much more flexible offensive and defensive options. These changes reduced its dependence on traditional heavy infantry, so long a mainstay of Roman warfare. By the 6th century, the Roman army had transformed to such a degree that it would hardly be recognized by the likes of Julius Caesar, Pompey, or Octavian. By 529, Justinian's accession and preoccupation with reorganization meant that the Persians were definitely better prepared for the war. Justinian responded as best he could, shoring up his position by fortifying a number of outlying cities on the frontier and by adopting several new commanders to govern them. One of these governorships was the Dux Mesopotamiae, whose capital was the contentious city of Dara, and whose defence was entrusted to Belisarius. When orders were given to fortify a town lying to the south, at Tanurin, Then, a key trade gateway, the Persians moved to prevent it. Belisarius and several other regional commanders marched to intercept them, but the wily Persians had laid a series of booby-trapped pits and ditches into which most of the Byzantine commanders impetuously charged without prior screening and were subsequently routed and killed. Belisarius, having been more cautious in his approach, avoided the trap, but being unable to relieve his beleaguered fellow commanders, was himself forced to retreat with his cavalry back to Dara, the mission ending in failure. He was instead ordered to fortify another town, Mindous or Melebassa, in the north. Here we get an early glimpse of the character of Belisarius by contemporary chronicler Zacharias Retos. Zacharias was the bishop of Mytilene, a town on the island of Lesbos, which itself, in time, would produce another legendary military leader 1,000 years later, Hayreddin Barbarossa. Check out our video on the Barbarossa brothers for more details.
The Romans, when Belisarius was duke, wished to make a city at Melebassa. Belisarius was not greedy after bribes, and was kind to the peasants, and did not allow the army to injure them. But the Persians sent an army which prevented the Romans from effecting their purpose, and put them to flight in a battle which he fought with them on the hill of Melebassa.
Outnumbered, exposed, and without reinforcements, Belisarius was once again forced into a fighting retreat back to the safety of Dara. Despite these setbacks, his ability to regroup his forces to prevent a complete rout meant that he retained his command, where a lesser general would have lost both his job and possibly his head. Indeed, not only did he retain his governorship, but in 529 he earned a promotion to the rank of Magister Militum per Orientem, the ancient equivalent of field marshal of an entire theatre. He was given orders to prepare for an invasion of Persia and immediately implemented a rigorous regime of drills and training to improve the morale and cohesion of his demoralized army. But the invasion was to come from the Persians, and it wasn't long in arriving. By June of 530, a Persian army comprised of 40,000 battle-hardened veterans was making its way to besiege Dara. Belisarius only had 25,000 soldiers at his disposal, made up of 3,000 cavalry, supported by 22,000 infantry, most of whom were raw recruits, press-ganged from neighbouring cities. These he considered highly unreliable, so they were hastily trained in archery and cavalry defence tactics, rather than hand-to-hand fighting. As the Persians approached, he now took the astonishingly bold decision to deploy outside the city walls, facing the enemy. Despite the odds, he knew that being subject to a siege limited his options and ability to control the battle. So instead, he had his soldiers dig a network of defensive trenches in a U-shape, placing his cavalry forward on both wings, with his infantry deep within the centre. He knew that the enemy would avoid being drawn deep into an attack on his centre, where they might be vulnerable to envelopment and missile attack from three sides. By exposing his wings, he hoped to divide the enemy forces and lure them to attack both sides separately, which would be slowed by having them cross ditches, giving his own cavalry time to withdraw, reform and counterattack, aided by missile fire coming from the centre. A lure, retreat and counterattack strategy well rehearsed by his Hunnic cavalry, and one that would become the hallmark of the Mongols hundreds of years later. As the two sides faced off, chroniclers tell us of the surprise expressed by the Persians at the order and discipline of the Roman lines. Over the preceding century, they had flogged the Romans numerous times in open combat and had come to view them as a second-rate opponent, easily routed. But today, there was something different about them, a determination not seen before. The Persian commander, Perizes, now sent a message to Belisarius, condescendingly instructing him to prepare a bath for him. A champion was now sent out on horseback to mock and provoke the Romans into losing their nerve, even challenging Belisarius himself to come out and face him in a duel. Instead, the general, perhaps in mockery of the Persians' own message, now sent out Andreas, his own bath slave, who was in his former occupation actually a wrestling coach. So when the lowly loinclothed servant speared the bragging champion through the chest, the Persians fell silent in shock. Another champion now rode out to avenge his compatriot, and he too was brought down by the unlikely hero, to the great delight of the cheering defenders. Considering this to be a bad omen, the stunned Persians withdrew for the night, but returned the next day, bright and early, with a freshly arrived contingent of another 10,000 troops to reinforce them. Outnumbered 2-1, Belisarius now sent his own message to the Persian commander, offering a peaceful negotiation to end hostilities. The message read,
"The first blessing is peace, as is agreed by all men who have even a small share of reason. The best general, therefore, is the one who is able to bring peace from war."
On the face of it, the offer of diplomacy might be viewed by the Persians as an admission of weakness and lull them into being overconfident. Considering the youth of their commander, the inexperience of his recruits, and the sheer weight of numbers, that was exactly the conclusion the Persian commander came to. But Belisarius was also a devout Christian, who history would go on to show was always prepared to give his enemies a way out of each confrontation. A second day came and went in a similar standoff and minor skirmishes, but by the third day, the Persian commander, risking a loss of face at his hesitation, finally took the bait and, as predicted, launched his divided cavalry towards the exposed wings of the Roman army, first the left, then the right. In both instances, the Roman cavalry fell back, as the infantry now unloaded into the flanks of the advancing Persians. When they had drawn them deep into the maze of trenchworks, the Roman cavalry reformed and charged, smashing into the confused Persians, while the Huns emerged from their sheltered centre position to cut off their rear. The Persian cavalry broke formation, routed, and was chased down by the pursuing Huns, while the Persian infantry, seeing the collapse of their legendary regiment of immortals, also now routed and fled the field, being smashed by pursuing Bucelari cataphracts and Herul lancers. It was an astonishing victory against all the odds, whose genius tactics would go on to grace the textbooks of military academies the world over. Moreover, following the rout, Belisarius quickly recalled his pursuing cavalry, fully aware of the Persians' own propensity to rally and counterattack. He was under no illusions as to the motivations of poorly paid soldiers to swarm and loot an enemy camp, leaving themselves highly exposed, and he would consistently forbid his troops from plundering, a characteristic that differentiated him from virtually every other commander of the time, who relied on satisfying their soldiers' lust for booty to stay loyal. But the victory at Dara would be short-lived, and Belisarius' reputation would be questioned during another Persian invasion the following year. A large force of cavalry had crossed into Roman Syria, a sector they had never previously penetrated, such that Belisarius was unsure if it was merely a diversion. He nevertheless assembled an army to intercept them, with his rapid advance catching the enemy off guard and causing them to withdraw or risk being cut off. As the Persians retreated, he finally caught up to them on Easter Saturday. His officers, motivated by their superior numbers, were eager to attack the enemy on the morrow. But Belisarius, aware that his army had been fasting in religious observance and was now in a weakened state, hesitated to commit them to battle, especially on Easter Sunday, which he believed would be a sacrilege. The enemy commander, Azarethes, sent a message requesting a truce, for the sake of Christians in both their armies, and Belisarius was inclined to grant the request, but his officers and men, newly encouraged by their recent victory at Dara, were outraged, and reports tell us that they were on the verge of mutiny. So Belisarius caved into their demands, and on Easter Sunday, 531 AD, the two armies formed up on the right bank of the Euphrates, near the town of Callinicum, at Raqqa in modern Syria. Belisarius had his heavy Bucellari and Huns form up in the centre, with his heavy infantry on the left flank, bordering the river for additional safety. He had his less reliable allied infantry force on higher ground to his right, flanked by another allied force of Ghassanid cavalry on its extremity. The Persians assembled their own cavalry forces in a balanced way along the entire front. The battle was opened by a customary exchange of arrows, which, as usual, proved indecisive. But noting the weaker composition of the Romans' right flank, the Persians reinforced their own left and advanced, putting significant pressure on Belisarius's allies. Hampered by a lack of visibility, he had failed to see the Persian redeployment and acted too late to reinforce his own beleaguered lines. As the right wing collapsed, the enemy turned the Roman line, and his allies fled the field. Suspiciously quickly, we are told, and Belisarius now found himself surrounded, with his back to the river. Sources now vary, but in one account, he dismounts and fights alongside the infantry in a defensive square till nightfall, when the enemy, having themselves sustained massive losses, withdraws, and the Romans finally manage to evacuate in boats across the river. In another account, Belisarius and his cavalry units flee the field, leaving his unfortunate infantry to their fate. While the battle itself was unquestionably a decisive victory for the Persians, it was nevertheless a Pyrrhic one, which forced them to the negotiating table. Within a year they signed an eternal peace treaty. Belisarius, despite having been subject to a threatened mutiny, took the full blame for the debacle, but a subsequent court-martial found him not guilty of dereliction. He was nevertheless relieved of his position and recalled to Constantinople by Justinian. It was to be the last he would see of the Middle East for quite a long time. Now, back in Constantinople, Emperor Justinian himself was having a hard time of things. He had been busy implementing a monumental review, reform, and codification of the entire Roman legal system in an attempt to reduce corruption, waste, and improve transparency. The corpus of work that emerged was so profound that it formed the bedrock of European jurisprudence for the next 1,000 years. Some of these reforms included legislation prohibiting the exploitation of women and the protection of children. fairer settlements in cases of divorce, as well as the provision of free medical care and public housing for the poor. These measures were to be financed by increasing the marginal tax rate of the wealthy, and by a streamlining of the public service, which culminated in the sacking of thousands of bureaucrats, along with the imprisonment of hundreds of others convicted of bribery and fraud. This draining of the swamp, so to speak, by an ethnic Thracian outsider had the predictable effect of incurring the wrath of the well-entrenched Greco-Roman oligarchy, long used to riding the public gravy train. Now, the Romans, beside their mania for gladiatorial sports, were also completely obsessed with chariot racing. Like modern Formula One, the sport was dominated by a couple of well-established teams, financed by high-profile businessmen and senators. At the time, the two major rival competitors were the Greens and the Blues. Think McLaren versus Ferrari, except that in Constantinople, these teams were also tied into political factions. Let me explain. The Greens were largely supported by trade, industry, and civil service officials. The Blues were the team of the aristocracy and landholders. As such, team rivalry was driven by an undercurrent of the working class versus the ruling class. Now, you might think that Justinian, being a foreigner, and his notorious ex-courtesan wife Theodora would naturally be drawn to the Greens, assuming, that is, that they were sports fans. But the fact of the matter was that, precisely because of their dubious background, they instead insinuated themselves into the Blues faction, not simply because of their own pretensions to nobility, but also to possibly gain some control over the political activities of the team. You see, the rivalry between the Greens and the Blues had morphed far beyond that of sports clubs providing public entertainment. The clubs had become unionized champions of all sorts of socially significant programs, as well as political activism, for which the general public lacked any kind of alternative outlet. They sponsored guilds and charities. They lobbied politicians and judges on behalf of aggrieved members, and they represented the concerns of various ethnic and even religious factions, using the platform of the arena to chant slogans and hurl abuse at one another. Rampant hooliganism and public brawling frequently spilled over into the streets, occasionally leading to riots and looting. Just like today. I suppose some things never change. In an urban environment of instability, poverty, and regular outbreaks of plague, factions even set up vigilante militias to police the streets, taking matters of law and order into their own hands. Sports hooligans were soon recruited into paramilitary gangs, run by mafia-like crime syndicates, with politicians, businessmen, and even emperors on their payrolls. But now, with Justinian's reforms targeting the civil service as well as taxing the wealthy, both the Blues and the Greens became increasingly hostile to him, often chanting abusive slogans during races and venting their fury in spillover riots. In his zeal to reform the economy, the emperor had unwittingly achieved the impossible, uniting two intractable rival teams against him. On one occasion, a number of rioting hooligans had been arrested and sentenced to death in the usual public forum. But when the bodies were lowered from the gallows, two of the condemned were found to be still alive, and monks, seeing it as a sign of divine intervention, quickly removed them to a monastery where they convalesced under their protection. It just happened that one of the survivors was a blue and the other a green supporter. Both factions now came together calling on the emperor to issue them a pardon, but Justinian, in power for 5 years and confident of his authority, dismissed the appeal. Unwilling to break the sanctuary of the monastery, he instead posted guards outside the gates, hoping to starve them out. The entire city, already tense and suspicious of Justinian's centralization of power and growing autocracy, now erupted into widespread rioting. The chaos culminated during race day, when the rival factions, having exchanged their usual mutual abuse, now began chanting in unison, Nika, Nika, the Greek word for victory or conquest. The emperor, sitting in his box, gradually realized that the chanting was being directed towards him, so he withdrew back into the palace, which adjoined the hippodrome. The unified crowd now spilled out into the streets, and mobs burned and looted their way through the entire city, even setting fire to the original church of the Hagia Sophia. The emperor tried to placate the mob, commuting the sentence of the convicts and even promising to sack his anti-corruption ministers, who, it should be said, had become suspiciously wealthy during their purging of the civil service. But the crowd ignored him and the rioting continued. As the days dragged on, entire suburbs of the city went up in flames, but the epicenter of activity still remained the hippodrome, where faction leaders now began plotting with disgruntled senators to take advantage of the chaos and depose the emperor. The plan was to replace him with another legitimate Greek claimant called Hypatius. Assuming the emperor had already fled the city, a mob now swarmed Hypatius's home and swept him and his wife up to the hippodrome, where preparations for a coronation ceremony had already begun. Justinian lost his nerve and had indeed decided to flee, but the Empress Theodora, displaying a courage hard won from her tough youth on the streets, insisted they stay put, either to quash the riot or die trying. Justinian, inspired by his gutsy wife, now turned to his generals, Mundus, a fearless Gepard barbarian, and Belisarius, freshly arrived from the east with his own heavy cavalry veterans. He demanded of them to do whatever it took to restore order. At first, bags of gold were sent out to bribe the Blues to stand down, and while some disbanded, the riots nevertheless continued. News of the usurper coronation now drew huge crowds of rioters back into the hippodrome, and as the stadium filled once more, the generals led their troops to occupy the exits and arrest the ringleaders. Soldiers already stationed within the stadium refused to obey their orders, and Belisarius urgently sent word that even the imperial guards were in revolt. Without the support of these troops, there was nothing for it now but to break up the mob on his own, so he ordered his cavalry to charge through the entrance gate, crashing headlong into the crowd. Hearing the commotion, Mundus, who was positioned at the other end of the hippodrome, also ordered a charge from his end, sandwiching the mob, and a panicked stampede now ensued as fleeing rioters were crushed underfoot. By the end of the day, tens of thousands of people were dead. Hundreds of ringleaders, senators, and guardsmen were arrested, and the usurper Hypatius, despite his pleas of innocence, was executed. Half the city had been destroyed in the rioting, and Justinian now ordered it and the smouldering Hagia Sophia to be rebuilt on an even grander and ambitious scale, to serve as an emblem both of his own power and of Byzantine sophistication, engineering, and piety. Modern Constantinople, despite being known as Istanbul, is very much a city of Justinian's making, and its iconic landmarks continue to awe and inspire visitors to this very day. With order restored and a peace treaty with Persia signed, the emperor continued in his efforts at reform. It's at this time that Belisarius's personal secretary, advisor, and biographer, Procopius, informs us of his marriage to Antonina, the Empress Theodora's chief lady-in-waiting and personal confidant. Like her patron, Antonina was low-born, and also said to have spent her youth in the adult entertainment industry, which is probably where she met and befriended Theodora. Antonina was more than 20 years his senior, and already had a number of children from several previous marriages. Procopius's writings clearly display a dislike of her, on numerous occasions recounting Antonina's debauched and degenerate lifestyle, even after she and Belisarius were married, a characterization that is the subject of much contention by some modern historians. Despite this, it was still an odd union, to be sure, unless you consider it a strategic move by the Empress to keep this up-and-coming young general under strict surveillance by her own personal agent. Procopius certainly seemed to think so. Indeed, unusual for the time, Antonina was to accompany Belisarius on all of his future campaigns, regardless of destination, and we know that she kept Theodora fully informed of his every move, exerting a Cleopatra-like influence over him, much as Theodora herself had over Justinian. For his part, Belisarius, now a man of consequence, yet lacking an heir of his own, and with Antonina struggling to conceive, adopted a Thracian youth called Theodosius, baptizing him and formally recognizing him as his own son. Antonina was delighted, but not in a good way. Anyway, you recall that the kingdom of the Vandals, over in North Africa, was a powerful maritime state that also controlled the major Mediterranean islands of Corsica, Sardinia, and the Balearic Islands off Spain. Ruling out of the ancient city of Carthage, in 455 they had even managed to sack Rome again, something that even legendary Carthaginian general Hannibal had failed to achieve once, back in the good old days. Recall also that, unlike their other Gothic cousins, the Vandals were not interested in maintaining Roman institutions and customs. Instead, they openly persecuted all non-Arian Christian denominations and implemented their own ethnic judicial code. Their alliance with the Gothic kingdom in Italy had long since dissolved, and several recent catastrophic defeats at the hands of local Berber chieftains had compromised the security of the kingdom. Its new king, Hilderic, actually a childhood chum of Justinian, was concerned about ongoing Berber aggression, so he reached out to his old mate asking for Roman protection, even offering to subordinate the kingdom to the empire and promising to curb anti-Roman discrimination. But the king's cousin, Gelimer, outraged at what he saw as a betrayal of Vandal independence, staged a coup and took the throne for himself, imprisoning Hilderic and doubling down on the repression of Romans within the state. This now gave Justinian a legitimate casus belli, and having just brought home several legions from the Persian War He had the perfect general to lead an expedition to Africa, Belisarius. Loyal, ethnically kindred, devoutly Christian, and of similar age, they had become somewhat close friends, such that Justinian felt he could trust Belisarius not to conquer Africa all for himself, as many other Roman generals had an unsettling proclivity throughout history to do. Plans were now rapidly put in place to mount an expeditionary force of 10,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry, supplemented by another 1,000 Hun and Herul mercenaries to be ferried across the sea in an amphibious invasion of Carthage to reclaim Africa for the Roman Empire. So it was that by early 533 AD, Belisarius was once again appointed Magister Militum, or Field Marshal, and with his missus, Antonia, in tow, the army was hastily dispatched by sea. The fleet skirted around the Greek mainland and then headed west towards Sicily. A drunken brawl among several Huns was punished by impalement, something that shocked his subordinates as an excessive punishment for lads just being lads. They were Huns after all. But Belisarius had expressly forbidden the consumption of alcohol while on campaign. This incident, according to one historian, highlighted the extremes of character he was capable of. After the Battle of Dara, he had given out of his own personal funds for the care of injured soldiers, but when their behaviour threatened the success of a mission, he could be ruthless to excess. Especially after the near mutiny at Callinicum, he was not taking any more chances. The general soon received word of a rebellion on Sardinia, and dispatched 400 of his own men to aid the rebels, who were to then join them later. The rest of the fleet sailed for the port of Syracuse in Sicily, where the embattled Goth regent, Amalasuintha, had promised them provisions and a staging base for the invasion. Their intelligence reported that the Vandals were still ignorant of the Armada and had dispatched 5,000 of their best troops to Sardinia to quash the insurrection there. This was great news, so there was no time to lose, and the fleet now quickly embarked, sailing past Malta and coming ashore completely unopposed at Caput Vada, a small town about 150 kilometres south of Carthage. Belisarius gave orders to secure and fortify the site, and scouts informed him that Gelimer was 4 days' ride away, far inland and to the south. The next morning, he received word that a number of his soldiers had been out foraging and had raided the orchards of local townspeople. He immediately mustered the entire army, punished the miscreants in the presence of the town elders, and took the opportunity to admonish his troops to treat the locals with respect, as many of them were Roman Christians and viewed them as liberators. If the army was to have any hope of success, or at least of returning home alive, their support and hospitality, not to mention espionage, was crucial. From this point onwards, chroniclers report that the army's behaviour was exemplary, and as they set out on their march to Carthage, town after town opened its gates to them. News travels fast. Vandal king Gelimer, though blindsided by the invasion, nevertheless also acted swiftly, sending word to his brother in the capital to execute the deposed Hilderic, and then conscript every able-bodied man to march to the valley of Ad Decimum, on the outskirts of the city, where he hoped to intercept and ambush Belisarius between the main army and his own forces marching from the south. The Romans made steady progress along the coastal road, with 300 heavy cavalry under John the Armenian screening the advance. The lightly armoured Hun and Herul mounted archers were screening the left flank, about 4 kilometres inland, while Belisarius guarded the rear with his elite Bucellari and Comitatus cavalry, providing protection for the bulk of the infantry in the centre, should Gelimer catch up to them. The fleet was to make its way north in parallel, patrolling the coastline. They managed to march about 14 kilometres per day, such that by the 10th day they were close to the valley in which Gelimer had hoped to launch his ambush. John the Armenian's advance guard came into contact with the advance parties of the army making its way out of Carthage, the rest of whom were strung out down the long road from the capital, making their way leisurely to the rendezvous. The Vandal army was, at this point, still completely unformed, casually plodding its way in small groups. The rapid advance of the Romans had caught them unprepared, as they had expected them to be delayed by conquering the towns and cities en route. But John, seeing an opportunity, now launched his cavalry, the heavy lancers ploughing right through the shocked Vandal camp, killing Gelimer's brother and leaving a trail of carnage for kilometres behind them, as the entire Vandal column dissolved, its conscripts fleeing for their lives. By the end of the day, the Roman cavalry was virtually at the walls of Carthage, before they turned around to mop up what was left of the enemy on the way back to rejoin Belisarius. Meanwhile, Gelimer, on his way from the south, had sent his nephew ahead via a side road, with a detachment of 2,000 Vandal cavalry to secure an alternative route and to engage the Roman flank such that Gelimer could himself hit them from the rear when his main force arrived soon after. The plan was to envelop the Romans from all sides, but little did he know that his brother was already dead, and the army marching out of Carthage had just been completely annihilated by Belisarius's advance guard. To make matters worse, Gelimer's nephew now stumbled upon the Huns and Heruls, who were, if you recall, providing a flanking screen in that very vicinity. These descendants of Attila now showed the Vandals just why the Pope had called their ancestors the Scourge of God, wiping out the entire Vandal cavalry down to the last man. So it was that Gelimer, already having failed to synchronize the arrival of his own forces, now actually arrived on the scene ahead of, rather than behind, Belisarius's main army, engaging what he thought was their rear guard, but which was actually his light infantry advance scouts. These Gelimer engaged and easily overwhelmed, and as they fled, he surveyed the field and assumed that Belisarius must already be near the city walls. Rather than interrogate prisoners or send out his own scouts to assess the situation, he hesitated, stricken with grief over the discovery of his brother's body, unsure of whether to march toward the capital or to retreat and await the return of Sardinian reinforcements. Belisarius, on the other hand, when the routed infantry finally made it to his headquarters and informed him of events, quickly formed up his Roman columns and marched to engage the Vandal army. Finding them milling about in a state of confusion, the Romans fell upon them and in short order completely routed them, with Gelimer and a handful of his men barely escaping alive, fleeing to the west of the country. It wasn't till nightfall that Belisarius understood the full extent of his crushing victory, when John the Armenian and his advance guard returned to tell him of their own success. The next day, the Romans marched on to the capital, to find the city gates wide open and the local population celebrating their arrival. Belisarius cautiously remained outside the city till the next morning, and once again admonished his troops to be on their best behaviour. They were indeed welcomed as liberators, and the fleet now also anchored in the Bay of Tunis, as the general set about improving their fortifications. Within a couple of months, Gelimer had received his reinforcements from Sardinia, and with the support of several local chieftains, now finally marched on the capital. Belisarius, as he had done in Persia, drew up his army outside the wall to meet him, entrusting the entire Roman cavalry to John the Armenian, while he led the infantry. They advanced on the Vandal position, forming up near Gelimer's camp at Tricamerum, some kilometres from the capital, where John, arriving first, deployed the cavalry behind a small stream. The enemy, without any archers whatsoever, deployed in a single line opposite, with the freshly returned Sardinian expeditionary forces and Gelimer's brother Tsazon leading its best infantry in the centre. When Belisarius and his infantry finally arrived, he honoured John the Armenian with command of the standard, while Belisarius advised him from behind. The battle began with Roman mounted skirmishers unleashing volleys into the Vandal centre. This provoked a Vandal charge to disperse them, after which the Vandals then also withdrew back to their own lines. A second skirmish attempted to provoke another Vandal charge, which again, having scared off the archers, simply returned to their lines. But Belisarius noticed that the Vandal wings didn't participate in either of the two repulses, so took this to mean that they were less committed to the battle than the others. He now advised John to order a full charge by their own heavy cavalry, directly at the Vandal centre, smashing into it with full force and penetrating all the way to its rear, killing Tsazon and sending his troops into a panic. The Vandal wings, seeing the disintegration of their centre, now promptly routed, as the entire Roman army now charged forward, pursuing them all the way to their fortified camp. But the Roman army, composed of numerous foederati clans and mercenaries, having not been properly drilled before the campaign, and continually restrained by their general for so long, now went completely berserk, scattering in all directions in hot pursuit of loot and pillage. Had the Vandals been more disciplined or better led, Gelimer might have rallied and counterattacked, catching the preoccupied Romans and annihilating them in turn. But fortunately for Belisarius, no such thing happened, and the enemy dispersed, never posing a significant threat again. To highlight the madness of the Roman frenzy, John the Armenian, usually a competent and disciplined commander, pursued Gelimer with his cavalry across the entire country for 5 whole days, before he was himself killed in an accident. Gelimer was eventually hunted down and forced to surrender, returning to Constantinople in chains, along with hundreds of his own soldiers and a secret treasure ship that just happened to fall into Belisarius's hands. This victory, while decisive in effectively returning North Africa to the Roman Empire, highlighted just how difficult it was to control an army comprised not only of allies of diverse ethnicities, but also of mercenaries driven by the prospect of loot and pillage. Economic challenges in the 6th century meant that soldiers were now more poorly paid than ever, which put extraordinary pressure on commanders to maintain discipline, even among professional legionnaires. It was a problem that was to plague not only Belisarius, but every other general of the age. Having secured this momentous victory, Belisarius got wind of a rumour that several of his own generals had written to Justinian back in Constantinople, telling him that Belisarius was about to go rogue and declare himself king. So when he received a letter from the emperor congratulating him on his momentous victory and casually inquiring whether he wished to return or remain stationed in Africa, Belisarius wisely saw it for the test that it was, and returned to Constantinople with Gelimer, Antonina, and ships packed to the gunwales full of treasure. Interestingly, including the very menorah plundered from Jerusalem in 70 AD, that the Vandals had themselves looted during their sack of Rome in 455. I kid you not. In gratitude, Justinian granted Belisarius a triumph, the first and only traditional Roman triumph celebration ever held in the city, and the first one in centuries that celebrated the victory of a non-emperor general. In scenes that must have been reminiscent of Scipio Africanus's own return from Carthage in 201 BC, Belisarius now led his own captives and immeasurable plundered treasures in an enormous parade through the heart of the city, though he was not to receive the coveted laurel crown. That honour was reserved for Justinian, since the victory was considered to be his. It's interesting to note at this point that neither did Belisarius receive the much vaunted agnomen or epithet of Africanus, Vandalis, or any other such as he had later earned that would have been the convention for victorious generals in previous times. Some historians believe it was due to the emperor's paranoia at elevating a general too highly. Others have said it was because the practice had by now fallen out of favour, or also possibly due to Belisarius's own modesty. We know that he frequently refused to accept later honours and material rewards, often giving credit to his subordinates, treacherous as they turned out to be. Whatever the case, Belisarius was now a big deal, and the Empress Theodora grew ever more wary of him. Ironically, recalling him from Carthage turned out itself to become a major headache for the emperor. You see, the native population of Berber tribesmen, fearful of the Roman heavy cavalry, had been relatively passive since their arrival there. But with Belisarius's departure, they quickly rose up and began menacing the hinterland, eroding the gains won by his army and plundering regional towns. To make matters worse, imperial tax collectors now arrived on the scene to conduct a census in order to properly administer the fleecing of their new North African citizenry, who soon began regretting their own liberation from one group of tyrants only to be replaced by another. Worse still, those Vandals who were not taken away in chains were now themselves subject to religious persecution, such that they soon joined with their Catholic neighbours, till recently subjects of Vandal oppression, and in a bizarre coalition they fomented rebellions all across North Africa that would take decades to quash. The garrisoned army was disinclined to act against them, because those imperial bureaucrats who were sent to tax the people had themselves neglected to deliver the wages due to the army.
Not a great plan.
Despite these irritating setbacks, Justinian still had stars in his eyes. You see, he had come to entertain the fantasy of reunifying the entire Roman Empire by reconquering the provinces lost to the various Gothic invaders. And now, serendipitously, he got just the chance he was hoping for. The Ostrogothic kingdom, ruling the Italian peninsula, had for some time been in a state of turmoil and decline. You recall that it was currently under the regency of Amalasuintha, the mother of Athalaric, who was still a minor. She had tried to secure her grip on power by raising him along a Roman model, which antagonized the Gothic aristocracy that had wanted to rule Italy as a type of apartheid state. Increasingly concerned about being overthrown, she now appealed to Justinian, both for legitimacy and protection, but she also tried to hedge her bets by marrying the only other contender for the crown, her cousin Theodahad. Meanwhile, the Goth nobles sought to extinguish Amalasuintha's claim by corrupting and debauching the young crown prince behind her back, who, by the tender age of 16, had become a jaundiced and debilitated alcoholic, finally expiring from booze and binging in 534. The kid stood no chance. Much as had just happened in North Africa, the Queen Regent was soon deposed by her usurper cousin/husband, and Justinian, now under the pretext of protecting her, moved quickly to appoint Belisarius once again as Magister Militum, at the head of yet another hastily assembled invasion force. The plan was to invade Sicily, gauge the receptiveness of the locals to liberation, and, if favourable, proceed north from there. In the meantime, he tried to sweet-talk Theodahad into accepting imperial overlordship, much as his early predecessors had done. This time, Belisarius was given less troops than before, only around 8,000 men, again comprised largely of conscripts, foreign barbarian mercenaries, and foederati, who were similarly embarked with little preparation or tactical coordination. That Justinian seriously expected a motley crew of less than 10,000 men to conquer the entire Italian peninsula was either breathtakingly ambitious or galactically stupid. By the summer of 535, the invasion fleet had disembarked at Catania, and the army quickly secured the city with little opposition. Scouts reported that the local mood was favourable, and by the end of the year, thanks to his usual insistence on discipline and respect for the local inhabitants, all of Sicily was once again back under Roman control, with the last of the Goth garrisons surrendering at Panormus, or modern Palermo. The story goes that the fortress was too well defended to assault directly, but that the walls adjacent to its harbour were actually quite low. So Belisarius packed his fleet into the harbour, hoisted rowboats atop their masts, in which stood archers that gradually picked off the defenders until the walls could be safely scaled, forcing the surrender of the entire garrison. The Romans had just taken an entire fortress with barely the loss of a single man. That was the kind of thinker Belisarius was. Justinian now acted to shore up support further afield, sending another army into Dalmatia and inviting the Franks, themselves busy conquering Burgundy, to have at the Goths in the north of Italy and take what they pleased, with Justinian's full blessing. But his plans of sending Belisarius across the Straits of Messina and onto the mainland were frustrated by the continuous rebellions in North Africa, which had now transformed into a full-scale revolt, facilitated by a number of mutinous generals who led their as-yet unpaid soldiers into taking the province for themselves. The rebel army, well over 10,000 strong, was a coalition of mutineers, Vandal exiles, and disgruntled locals. This humiliating state of affairs that risked the loss of an entire province, so recently won, was intolerable. So rather than let Belisarius continue his campaign, Justinian redirected him to Carthage to quell the rebellion. Arriving just in time to prevent a siege and leaving most of his army behind on Sicily, Belisarius disembarked with only 100 of his personal bucellarii and gathered the remaining garrison troops to lead them out of the city against the besieging army. Hearing of his return, the miscreants, despite greatly outnumbering our general, withdrew to the back country, with Belisarius at the head of only 2,000 troops in hot pursuit, eventually catching up to them near the town of Membressa. Deploying their forces, a wind suddenly whipped up at the rear of Belisarius's position. The advantage it would prove to his archers prompted the enemy commander to try and redeploy his own forces at 90 degrees, shifting the axis of the front to negate the range advantage to Belisarius's missile units. But redeployments across the axis of a battlefield are fraught with risk. They make you temporarily vulnerable, and Belisarius, observing the enemy commander's tactic, now abandoned the usual ritual of trading arrow volleys and instead ordered a full-speed charge at the enemy, smashing his bucellarii into their manoeuvring flank and completely routing the disorganized enemy from the field. This use of heavy armoured lancer cavalry, originally a Persian development, was championed by Belisarius, who is generally credited with transforming European warfare forever by introducing the idea onto the continent. Having crushed the rebellion, Belisarius now returned to Sicily to resume his own campaign. By the spring of 536, the army had crossed the Straits of Messina and attacked Rhegium, which was held by Theodahad's own son-in-law. But down south there was no love lost for the Goths, and so he sued for peace and a cushy one-way ticket to Constantinople, leaving Belisarius to make a rapid advance northwards, soon laying siege to Naples. It was a strategy to be repeated 14 centuries later, when the Allies also used Sicily as a staging ground to invade the soft underbelly of Axis power in Italy. But for now, according to ancient custom, Belisarius offered the Neapolitan city fathers the traditional opportunity of avoiding a sacking by voluntarily surrendering the city. But the defenders, expecting reinforcements any day, mocked him from their impregnable fortress, knowing full well that he lacked the siege equipment or numbers to succeed before they got there. Several futile assaults were easily repulsed, and with time being of the essence, Belisarius moved to cut the city's aqueduct. By chance, an inspection of the now dry watercourse showed the possibility of widening the underground passage to give them direct access to the city's cisterns, and as his sappers worked through the night to prepare the tunnel, soldiers were tasked with making noise to distract the defending sentries. Just before dawn, 600 soldiers burst out of the tunnels and streamed into one of the towers, securing the gate while the rest of the army now poured in, taking the garrison completely by surprise. Despite his plea to exercise restraint, the army, comprised largely of barbarian mercenaries, sacked Naples with the kind of reckless abandon that would have made Attila the Hun proud. Not one to set modest goals, Belisarius had hoped to liberate Rome by the end of the year. It was now mid-November, and the Ostrogoth leadership, stunned by the catastrophic loss of Naples, now deposed Theodahad, their usurper king, and hastily elected a new one, Witiges. the recently deposed Queen Regent's own son-in-law, who, as you might expect, had Theodahad promptly assassinated, urgently sending 4,000 soldiers to garrison Rome. But the new Gothic king was in a bind. He knew that Belisarius would soon head north, but he also had to contend with a fresh Roman army approaching overland from Dalmatia, that was now poised to attack Italy from the east. To make matters worse, the Franks had been aroused to the possibility of scoring some territory from him in the north. With invasions looming from 3 directions, Witiges withdrew to his capital at Ravenna, where he could effectively intercept an attack coming from any sector. But to many in Rome, this smacked of indecision and abandonment, and entire regions of central and southern Italy now scrambled to offer their loyalty to Belisarius. The garrison at Rome, seeing the writing on the wall, also fled, and the Pope now sent an envoy to the general advising him that the city was his for the taking. So it was that on the 9th of December, 536 AD, a Roman army, albeit a Byzantine hodgepodge of mercenaries and barbarians, now entered the Eternal City as liberators, restoring it once again into the hands of the empire, and sending the symbolic keys of the city back to Justinian as a prize. No time was wasted in fortifying its walls, widening moats, and sending out detachments of troops to secure neighbouring cities along the main corridor over the Apennine Mountains, by which the enemy would most likely approach. By Christmas, many towns throughout Tuscany had come over to his side, including several Goth garrisons whose soldiers had long since married and integrated into local Roman life against the strict rules of the Ostrogoth kingdom. Thanks to a combination of luck, Goth disunity, and generous treatment of locals, Belisarius had more than achieved his campaign objectives, with much of southern Italy back in imperial hands, at the cost of astonishingly few casualties. He now hunkered down in Rome for the winter, awaiting the inevitable Gothic retaliation. He didn't wait long. By February of 537, the Goths were on the warpath, with conservative estimates of 30,000 or more soldiers. Not wasting time by besieging the outlying fortresses, the Goths marched straight on Rome, their advance guard surprising Belisarius himself while he was out scouting with his personal cavalry. The skirmish might have easily turned to disaster, but in fierce hand-to-hand fighting, the general and his personal bodyguard fought off the attackers and escaped back to the city. With soldiers deployed all across central Italy, Belisarius only had 5,000 men in Rome at his disposal, quite a few of whom had been conscripted from within the city itself. The Roman walls were far too long for either the Goths to encircle or for the defenders to adequately garrison. So detachments of sentries positioned at key weak points were to be reinforced by the cavalry, who would rapidly redeploy wherever pressure demanded it. The Goths, on the other hand, set up 7 camps at key approaches to the city to put pressure on Roman supplies and reinforcement. The Goths cut aqueducts, harried the defenders, and sent emissaries promising safe passage if they surrendered. But the defenders dug in, and Belisarius, still an engineer at heart, even had special water wheels built on the Tiber to power the flour mills that were dependent on it for the production of bread. Almost 3 weeks into the siege, the Goths finally launched an all-out assault, having constructed a number of siege towers and rams that were being slowly towed to the northern walls by teams of oxen. Ascending the battlements, Belisarius gave a wry smile and ordered his soldiers to stand down until he gave them orders. As the lumbering monoliths came within range of his archers, he took a bow from one of the sentries and personally shot 2 of the oxen team drivers. Bursting out in laughter, he now gave the order to let fly. Within minutes, weeks of Gothic engineering came to nothing, as the oxen were killed and the towers came to a dead halt, well short of the walls. Without the use of their siege towers, the disappointed Goths were forced to call off their much-anticipated assault. Needless to say, steak à la Gothica was on the menu in Rome that night. Frustrated, the Goths now moved to cut off Roman supplies coming in by sea, occupying the port at Ostia, but both supplies and reinforcements of 1,600 fresh cavalry now arrived from the south. These mounted archer units were deployed in dozens of regular hit-and-run sorties out of the many unpatrolled gates of the city, while the Goths, largely comprised of infantry, milling about in camps, were suddenly overrun by waves of Hunnic mounted archers and Roman heavy lancers. On occasion, cavalry sorties were designed to provoke a Gothic counterattack, only to themselves be hit by a mounted archer reception. Many thousands of Goths were killed in these regular skirmishes, for which they had little answer, and Witigis, after months of fruitless siege, appeared to have fumbled the initiative. Belisarius, on the other hand, sallied out at will, hardly conceding any casualties and running rings around the paralysed enemy that lacked any significant missile units. Moreover, with every available Goth soldier being deployed to the Rome sector, outlying cities were now vulnerable. Belisarius ordered his captains, situated in forts that had been bypassed along the way, to escalate their own raids on Goth supply lines, which they did, but also pushed out even further, capturing cities all the way to the east coast, including Ariminum, only a day's march south of Ravenna. The defenders were now growing cocky, and yet again, as in both his Persian and African campaigns, his staff officers, as well as city elders, began pressuring the general to tackle the Goths head-on. Facing yet another mutiny, he reluctantly agreed to a 2-pronged attack from different gates of the city. Belisarius would personally lead the main cavalry force in one camp attack directed at Witigis' personal command centre. Using a detachment of infantry, largely comprised of civilian conscripts, to act as a decoy, screen and rallying point in reserve. His cavalry force would conduct their usual hit-and-run provocations at the main enemy camp, and then rally behind the infantry in the event of fatigue or a counterattack. The same was to occur across the Tiber on another enemy camp situated there. In both cases, the infantry was ordered not to advance on the enemy under any circumstances. The engagement began successfully enough. The cavalry harassed Witigis' drawn-out lines and pummeled them with missiles in wave after wave of attacks. But this time, the enemy just stood there and took it, without either breaking or counterattacking. Across the Tiber, the second cavalry force actually managed to overrun the enemy, and the overconfident civilian reserve, eager for payback and seeing the enemy rout, now broke formation against orders, becoming an uncontrollable mob that charged the fleeing Goths, stopping only to loot their camp. Seeing this unusual turn of events, the Goth commanders rallied their forces and counterattacked the looting rabble, which, now having completely abandoned its formation, fled back to the gates in complete and utter panic, many being cut down by the reinvigorated Goths. Back on the other side, Belisarius' cavalry too, perhaps infused by the same overconfidence and now running low on ammo, engaged the Goths directly, and fierce hand-to-hand fighting ensued. Outnumbered and failing to rout the opponent, Belisarius's cavalry retired toward their infantry reserves, where they planned to regroup and rearm. But the infantry lost their nerve, and thinking that their own cavalry had routed, now themselves turned and fled, to which sight the Goth cavalry now charged, cutting them down by the hundreds. The Roman cavalry, exhausted from over-engagement, fought a rearguard action to hold them off, and were themselves almost destroyed in the retreat, with even Belisarius's personal guard almost being enveloped. It was a near catastrophe which might have easily been the end of the entire campaign. But fortunately, after a full year of siege, the Goths had themselves become so demoralized that they failed to capitalize on the one single victory they had won all year. For his part, with the subordinates and city elders sufficiently chastised, Belisarius returned to his tried and true program of sorties that had been so successful thus far. It was yet another textbook example of how insubordination almost led to disaster. With Romans now also occupying a coastal fortress so close to their own capital, Witigis saw no point in continuing the siege, and instead marched what remained of his army to retake Ariminum, dangerously situated in the Gothic rear. Belisarius recalled his commander from the city and ordered him to garrison it with minimal infantry, with the rest of the troops to join him in liberating the northwest sector, now virtually devoid of any Gothic presence. But the commander refused, we are told, because he was seeking his own personal glory. In any event, he now became a sitting duck, while Belisarius, meanwhile, marched into Liguria, supporting revolts further north at Mediolanum, or modern-day Milan. Now, you may be wondering where Antonina was this whole time, or maybe not, but I'm going to tell you anyway. She, of course, as expected, had accompanied her husband all the way to Naples, which she liked, but as the siege ended, made her way to Rome to assess the situation and report to her patron, the Empress. Moreover, it was to deliver instructions from Theodora, demanding that the Pope, who had been in the city the whole time, maintaining the morale of its citizens, now be removed from office, arrested and sent to Constantinople to stand trial, under accusations of collaboration with the enemy. Belisarius was indignant, but he knew full well that Theodora was, how shall I put this, the one who wore the pants at the palace. He understood that he had no choice but to deliver the shocked pontiff up to her for trial. The truth was that Pope Silverius was a supporter of a rival theological faction to the one favoured by the Empress, and this sacking was nothing more than a vindictive attempt at planting her own favourite on the throne of St. Peter. But the spurious allegations themselves were concocted entirely by Antonina, ever the Empress's faithful agent. The disgraced pontiff was eventually cleared of all charges and sent back to Rome, but the Empress once again had him arrested and this time exiled, dying soon after under mysterious circumstances. Belisarius, helpless to intervene, but feeling personally shamed, built a hospice and church to his memory in an act of penance. It wasn't the only humiliation he was to suffer at the hands of his wife. Hold that thought. It was around this time that another general now landed in Italy. Narses, an Armenian eunuch and close confidant of the emperor, had finally been sent with reinforcements to support Belisarius in the coming spring offensive. Despite being placed under his command, Narses was also highly regarded as a field commander in his own right, and being significantly older, openly challenged Belisarius's campaign strategy when they met in war council in 538. Narses had wanted to relieve the siege on Ariminum because its insubordinate commander was a close personal friend. The besieged commander had disobeyed Belisarius's earlier orders to evacuate, and was now, having placed himself in peril, desperately pleading for aid. Belisarius had planned to first mop up enemy fortresses in the south to secure their rear. But now, with open insubordination by Narses, he felt he had no choice but to relent and march to the relief of the beleaguered city. Despite now fielding 20,000 troops, the combined Roman army was still substantially outnumbered by Goth forces. So Belisarius hatched a plan to divide his army into three and approach the enemy position from several directions, but with special instructions to light triple the amount of campfires each evening as they rested. He also had the Roman navy appear offshore in a posture of amphibious assault. Sure enough, enemy scouts mistakenly assumed the approaching host was far larger than it actually was, with the Goths promptly lifting their siege and retreating to Ravenna. The deception had secured a key city without the loss of a single man, but the relieved garrison commander, in a shocking turn of events, publicly thanked his friend Narses rather than Belisarius, an insult which was later backed up by his openly challenging Belisarius's leadership and refusing to commit his own troops in upcoming offensives. Pro-Roman revolts had meanwhile broken out throughout modern Liguria, Lombardy and Piedmonte, and had come under attack by both Gothic and Frankish forces. But without these fresh reinforcements, Belisarius lacked the numbers to go and support them, such that within weeks, important cities such as Milan fell, and the entire northwest sector fell back under Goth control. The scandalous treachery of Narses and the catastrophic loss of a major city saw him recalled to Constantinople, and for a time, Belisarius once again had full command of all the troops on the ground. By the end of 539, his army had managed to secure all of Tuscany and the east coast, pressing north to besiege Ravenna itself, trapping Vitigers and the entire Goth elite in the city. On the way, they even captured the city's grain supply, and with the navy now blockading its ports, Vitigers and his nobles were forced to negotiate a surrender. The emperor sent an envoy offering to let him keep the north of the country if the Goths ceded the rest to his empire. Belisarius was furious that they should give such generous terms at this critical moment, and maintained his siege despite the deal being accepted. The Goths now became desperate and offered Belisarius himself the crown, as well as their loyalty if he spared them. Under the pretext of accepting their offer, the gates were opened, but no sooner had his troops marched into the city than Belisarius declared victory in the name of the emperor, seizing Vitigers and the treasury, though the army was once again forbidden to pillage or sack the city. Outlying regions soon surrendered voluntarily. In just 5 years, the entire Italian peninsula was again part of the Roman Empire, despite his army being completely outnumbered and suffering from a lack of supplies and reinforcements for most of that time. And yet Justinian, driven to paranoia by his wife, immediately recalled him to Constantinople, fearful that his greatest general might change his mind and keep the crown for himself after all. Having delivered Vitiges, much of his army and vast treasures, Belisarius should have been granted another celebratory triumph, but instead was given the cold shoulder. To make matters worse, his wife Antonina, having already humiliated him with the papal sacking scandal and behaving more like a parole officer than a wife, now appears to have gone completely off the rails. You see, for some time she had been conducting a torrid love affair with their adopted son. All throughout the African campaign, while her husband was off fighting the Vandals, she was shacked up in bed. Things had got so out of hand that the servants and even a number of Belisarius's officers were well aware of it, but nobody had the courage to tell him. By the time of the Gothic campaign, when they were stationed in Syracuse, half of Sicily was talking about it, until finally a servant girl could no longer bear the indignity and informed the general of the whole sordid affair. He flew into an understandable rage. Antonina, on the other hand, doubled down, called the witnesses liars, and had them put to death, swearing to her husband that she was, as always, his devoted wife. Like so many other great generals throughout history, Belisarius was a much better judge of men's characters than he was of women. The cold reception he got upon his return to Constantinople was as much to do with bedroom gossip as it was about imperial paranoia. He wasn't long in the capital before another ominous situation arose that would require his immediate involvement. Intelligence out of Persia had indicated that the Sassanids were raising another army and were again poised to invade the eastern provinces, and sure enough, by 541, a Persian army had marched into Lazica, a small Roman protectorate on the far eastern shore of the Black Sea, conquering it easily. The eastern frontier had long been neglected by Justinian in his preoccupation with reunifying the western part of the empire. So the poorly paid garrisons, holding forts on the Persian front, were now surrendering in droves. Belisarius was dispatched in all haste to counter the threat, correctly predicting that the enemy was planning to sweep south and conquer Jerusalem, at the time the third richest city in the empire. Once again, dealing with insubordination from commanders going it alone, then having to rescue them when they were exposed and vulnerable, he eventually forced their obedience and marched his army, again a hastily assembled, multi-ethnic, squabbling rabble, southwards along the bank of the Euphrates, shadowing the much larger Persian army, sending detachments far in advance to make the Persians think his column was larger than it actually was. In another brilliant act of deception, the Persian commander requested a parley, in part to get a closer look at Belisarius's troop numbers. But the wily general set a meeting point far forward of the main camp, and positioned 6,000 of his best troops in an arrangement that seemed far larger than it actually was. He had also planted spies that spread the rumor of a plague outbreak throughout the region, such that the Persian commander, seeing the enemy in seemingly good order and worried about his own exposure, called for a truce, retreating with his army back across the border. Belisarius had just prevented a major invasion by forces far superior and far outnumbering his own, through the sheer use of deception and maneuver. Sun Tzu would have been proud. With the crisis averted and a new disaster now brewing in Italy, Belisarius was recalled to the capital to be once again dispatched abroad. You see, following the victory over the Goths, Justinian, in an attempt to prevent any kind of serious usurpation of imperial rule, had distributed command of the army in Italy among 11 different generals, none of whom displayed much competence in governing their various regions, but all of whom displayed an astonishing level of corruption and apathy. The result was that the army remained largely unpaid, the local citizenry were taxed to the eyeballs, and the Goth aristocracy had much of their property confiscated. Just as in Africa, former foes now joined together in a revolt, while several generals declared their independence from the empire. By 544, most of northern Italy and even parts of the south had been lost to rebellion. Once again, Belisarius was sent in to clean up the mess. But this time, all he had at his disposal was 4,000 soldiers, and when he reached Ravenna, hoping to raise more troops, nobody enlisted, despite his warm reception there. You see, everyone knew full well that as soon as he left, Ravenna would once again be run by corrupt officials, so the benevolent attitude that had served him so well in all his past campaigns just wasn't going to fly anymore. Undermanned, he quickly set about deploying his meagre forces to capture a number of key supply routes, while reinforcing the garrisons of other beleaguered fortresses. Desertion was rampant, so he wrote desperately to Justinian, begging for more troops, money, and supplies. And being unable to achieve anything further that season, he sailed for Dalmatia to personally appeal to the emperor for aid. But Justinian was almost bankrupt following his enormous building program, and to top it off, Constantinople had just been hit by the plague, so both cash and soldiers were slow in coming. This meant that the Goths were able to lay siege to Rome itself, now for the second time. Belisarius took what steps he could, harrying and disrupting the siege, but lacking the resources for an outright engagement, the city fell in 546 AD. All he could do was play cat and mouse, reinforcing vulnerable garrisons while striking out to attack exposed enemy positions, slowing their advance across Italy. By 547, finally receiving a modest boost of a few thousand barbarian mounted archers, he managed to outmaneuver the Goths and headed straight for Rome, assaulting the now crumbling city and successfully liberating it, though it was, it should be said, by now almost deserted. Over the next 2 years, he operated more as a guerrilla leader than a Roman general, living off the land and striking the Goths when they were off guard, then disappearing again. His expert use of archery units was still something the Goths had little answer for, but by the end of 549, the campaign had become a stalemate. Frustrated and with no imperial support, he was finally recalled back to Constantinople, presumably due to a renewed threat by the Persians, but possibly also instigated by Antonina. You see, her great patron, the Empress Theodora, had died the previous year, and her many years of intrigue on her behalf had made Antonina many powerful enemies at court. Despite his years of humiliation at her hands, Belisarius was possibly all that now stood between Antonina and an assassin's garrote. In any case, he was glad to be home, retiring from active military service, and with the empress's death, it appears that Justinian, perhaps with lingering guilt at failing to support his best general, now had a change of heart and showered him with honours that were long overdue, even appointing him as his personal adviser and dispatching him on numerous diplomatic missions. But on one occasion, in 559, with armies dispersed far and wide, a force of 7,000 mounted Bulgars had crossed the Danube, headed straight for the undefended capital. Belisarius, now 60, was hastily ordered to defend the city, with little more than 300 lancers of his personal bodyguard and a small citizen militia. They laid an ambush for the enemy along a narrow path in thick woods, with his cavalry charging the enemy from both the front and the rear, while the militia struck from the cover of trees. The invaders were so thoroughly surprised and boxed in by the charge that hundreds fell, and the others fled for their lives back across the border. Once again, massively outnumbered and using sheer deception to his advantage, Belisarius returned home to a hero's welcome, and yet, once again, he was not to enjoy his victory for long. You see, some months later, a conspiracy to topple the emperor was uncovered. Several suspects were on the general's personal staff, one of whom had even implicated Belisarius as the ringleader. Given the nature of torture in those days, it's probable that the confession was a contrived one, and the general was subsequently put under house arrest and stripped of all honours, titles, and property. A public outcry led to a formal inquiry which exonerated him of all charges, and it remains unclear if the accusations were actually motivated by Justinian himself, or possibly other disgruntled courtiers hoping to get at his wife. An apocryphal legend subsequently arose in which the emperor had Belisarius blinded and forced him to spend the rest of his life begging for alms in the public square. The story, while false, became popular in later Byzantine and Enlightenment literature, symbolizing the ingratitude of rulers and the tragedy of fallen greatness, with several artists and writers, especially in France, making the legend into a potent allegory for justice, tyranny, and heroism betrayed. Though he was actually restored to all his former offices, this last and most personal betrayal was said to have been so distressing that he died soon after in 565, perhaps of a broken heart. So, what can we say about Belisarius, the last truly great general of Rome? One historian writes, though usually outnumbered and ill-supplied, he was a master of the art of converting his weakness into strength, and the opponent's strength into a weakness. His brilliant use of deception and maneuver, particularly during sieges, gave him more victories with negligible casualties than perhaps any other general in history, while his generous treatment of civilians and suppression of plundering by his soldiers was a testament to his character at a time of otherwise great brutality. The lack of resources and trained men, who were themselves drawn from vastly alien cultures, put enormous pressure on both strategic deployment and the chain of command, plagued as it was by constant insubordination. Through it all, he almost always managed to, nevertheless, snatch victory from defeat. The great military theorist, Prussian General Karl von Clausewitz, defined military genius as the balance of intelligence and character, tempered by self-control, something Belisarius had in spades. Gibbon, in his seminal treatise on the Roman Empire, said of him, "Amidst the perils of war, he was daring without rashness, prudent without fear, slow or rapid according to the exigencies of the moment, that in the deepest distress he was animated by real or apparent hope, but that he was modest and humble in the most prosperous fortune. By these virtues he equalled or excelled the ancient masters of the military art, and in the space of just 6 years recovered half the provinces of the Western Empire. Under his command, the subjects of Justinian often deserved to be called Romans." Now that's a legacy well worth honouring. Till next time. If you enjoy our content, please show us some love by liking and sharing with your friends, dropping a comment or two, and by subscribing to the channel. It really does help us grow and reach more people. Check out our socials and website too for additional material, interesting historical nuggets and news. If you've got some cash to spare and are feeling generous, why not become a Patreon supporter and immortalize your name in the credits of future videos? Or not, even anonymous cash is welcome. See the description section for options. Trust me, I'm a long way from quitting my day job. But whatever your position is, thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.